The YoloCam S7 is, I think, one of the most interesting cameras to come out in recent times. I've been using it since its release, and this video is not sponsored by Yolo, but they did send the S7. Actually, I'm recording this with an S7, and there's one here. I have two of them, but I do want to be clear. I don't care if you buy this camera. I'm not trying to convince you to buy this camera. I want to share some features and kind of talk about what it does. But the biggest motivating factor for me making this video today is I want to help contextualize this camera because I think it's really cool. I think it's a camera for anybody, but it's not necessarily for everybody. For some people, this might seem like a very confusing, potentially even overpriced camera. And for other people, it is the absolute perfect camera for their workflows. Now, if you're wondering what this camera even is, what am I even talking about? The YoloCam S7 is basically a mirrorless webcam. It's a micro 4/3 mirrorless camera, but if you also look at it, it doesn't have a lot going on the body here. If I bring over my Sony FX3, which it really seems like in terms of design, these two, share some similar design language. If you look at the FX3, this thing is just covered in buttons and switches. I have a flip out screen. I have dual memory card slots. I have a built-in battery. I have all kinds of mounting points. This is a camera that is designed for all kinds of high-end workflows. The S7 has, a lens release, has autofocus sensors, which are pretty interesting. We're going to talk about those in a second. In terms of ports, you have USB-C for power, USB-C for data, HDMI, full-size HDMI, and a 3.5mm audio input. And you have an accessory shoe on one side and a 1/4-20 on the other, which is actually the vertical side, and that is pretty interesting. I should point out that the two USB slots, you do need to have USB for power. That is how the camera is powered. And even if you're using HDMI or USB as a webcam like I'm doing right now, you need to have power connected as well. Some USB webcams only need one cable. It'll do power and data. This will not work that way because it is a full-on mirrorless camera. It requires a lot of power in order to be a mirrorless camera, so you always have to have USB power running in. And then you can either use USB or HDMI or both simultaneously for video. And throughout this entire video, the camera that is me is the S7. So anytime you see me on screen, except when we're gonna do a comparison with my Sony a7S III. Actually, let's do that right now. I thought it would be fun to see how the YoloCam S7 stacks up against my Sony a7S III, which is actually currently labeled as a7S III/FX3. The reason being that this camera has the exact same image sensor as my FX3, which is normally my main camera. I have it out here for comparison reasons in a little bit, but this is the exact same image quality as the FX3. It's the a7S III, and then of course this is the YoloCam S7. And I really just wanted to see how this, $700 mirrorless webcam stacks up against a $4,000 mirrorless camera. And the Sony camera is using my 24-70 2.8 lens, so it's about an $1,800 lens. The S7 is using a Lumix 25mm f1.7 lens. This is about a $250-ish lens. So very different price points, but they do look not entirely different from one another. Obviously, like I'm using Ecamm right now to record, I can mix and match the colors a little bit. I didn't spend a ton of time trying to match colors on these, but I could dial that in probably a little bit more. But in terms of just overall sharpness, the way the focus is working, background quality, background blur, what is interesting though, is you can see the difference between micro 4/3 and full frame sensors, because the S7, this is 25mm on a micro 4/3 sensor, and the a7S III, I'm zoomed into about 50mm roughly on a full frame sensor. So you can kind of see, roughly speaking, 50mm on full frame is about the equivalent of 25mm on micro 4/3. If that's helpful for what lens you might want to get. Both cameras are about 6 feet away, 2 meters away from me. So if that kind of helps you figure out, what lens might work for you on something like the S7, there's what I'm using right now. Let's go to the Sony and look at a few things. So we're talking about a f2.8 lens on a full frame sensor. Look at, how blurred out the Rodecaster buttons are. Look at the blur on the computer screen. If I now switch to the S7, we're at f1.7, so a wider aperture, but on a smaller sensor. You still have some nice background blur, but you notice it's not quite, the bokeh is not as bodacious as it was on the Sony camera, because we are still dealing with a smaller sensor. So They don't look exactly identical, but they're pretty darn close and at significantly different price points. And while I'm comparing both cameras, let's do some low light testing. So the Sony a7S III, basically all Sony cameras are known for being really, really good at low light performance. Those giant sensors, it just really helps with that. So if I turn off my key light and I turn off my fill light, this, I guess my exposure is not completely matching on the cameras. This is roughly what it looks like in person. And we're not necessarily looking at the brightness because they didn't perfectly match the exposure on the cameras, but if you look at the cleanliness, you know, the graininess or lack thereof, here is the S7, you know, how's the focus working? Can I still hold something up to the camera and have it focus on it and then shift back to me in the dark? That's pretty cool. And, you know, do we see any grain? Do we see any noise? It looks pretty clean to me. And if we go over here to the Sony, the a7S III, the Sony cameras, you know, they're known for being incredibly clean in low light. And that looks to be the case here as well. So I just wanted to see, since I am calling this a mirrorless webcam, how does it stack up against a very high-end mirrorless full frame camera? So now that we've seen how the S7 stacks up against the A7S, that's not confusing at all. Let's talk about some features of this camera and then try to contextualize it a little bit. Let me show you the software of this. So this is the YoloLiv Compose software. This runs on Mac and PC, and this is where you adjust all of the camera settings. So because there are no buttons, there are no physical controls on this camera, all of the settings have to be done through this software. And any settings you change on the camera stick with the camera. So if I change exposure and white balance and color and all that stuff here, and then I connect the camera separately through HDMI to another switcher or something, it's going to stick with these settings. So I'll just run through these. We have quite a few different options. There is a video setting option, which is where you can choose if you want 16:9 or 9:16. Do you want vertical or horizontal? Frame rate, I can't change that now because I'm using the camera, but we can go all the way up to 4K 60. And then vertical flip, I'm recording with the camera, so I can't show you this right now. Well, that will just flip the camera vertically. So if I, for some reason, had to mount this upside down and I just need to flip it in software, I could do that pretty easily. And then HDMI resolution, I can select that up to 4K. So if I'm using this through HDMI and I'm using it in a 1080 switcher like the Rodecaster Video or an A10 Mini, which, by the way, this will work as a USB webcam on the Rodecaster Video. Same with the YoloCam S3. So that Rodecaster can be kind of picky with what USB webcams it works with. It works with all the YoloCams. But if I'm just doing HDMI, that is a 1080 switcher. I could switch my HDMI resolution down to 1080. If I'm using it with a 4K switcher like the YoloBox Extreme, then I can switch HDMI to 4K. We've got our imaging settings here. So this is kind of funny. I typically match these with my Sony cameras, kind of like I showed earlier. So I have cool color selected. I can do warm colors, which is more Canon. And I have some eCam color happening as well. These won't perfectly match the YoloCam with Sony or Canon cameras, but just kind of pushes them in those directions a little bit, and then you can match. If you're using the YoloCam S3 and you go into this menu, it will actually say warm is Canon and cool is Sony. So I need all the help being cool I can get, so I use cool colors. And then you do have, you have sharpness, contrast, saturation, if you want to adjust those. And then you have distortion and vignette correcting, which are things, you can kind of see it happening on the edge of my screen here. Anytime you use a lens, it's going to distort things, using a real lens on a real camera. And then vignette, sometimes around the edge, things can be distorted. So let me go back to the main setting here. If I turn off distortion, that's what it looks like. And if I turn off vignetting, you kind of see a little bit of darkness around the edge there. I actually leave these off pretty much all the time because I have found that a lot of regular like USB webcams, they make everything look very flat and evenly exposed. But when you're using mirrorless cameras, higher end cameras, real lenses, interchangeable lenses, I should say, those have qualities that aren't perfect. They do kind of distort things and vignette things a little bit, and that's what gives those cameras the look that a lot of us really like. So I tend to leave these turned off because then that leans into the mirrorless quality of this camera. We also have some focus options. Channel's kind of interesting because we're using a different autofocusing system. We're not focusing through the lens or the sensor. We're actually using this sensor right here off to the side. This is how we're focusing, which works out because a lot of Micro Four Thirds lenses don't have the best autofocus. Micro Four Thirds used to be a very popular format before crop and full frame mirrorless was as reliable as it is now. Micro Four Thirds was kind of king. Now it's sort of, it's less popular. A lot of companies don't make Micro Four Thirds cameras anymore. The benefit to that meaning you can get a ton of Micro Four Thirds lenses for very inexpensive prices. You can choose different lenses, but you might find yourself using an older lens and that lens might not have the best autofocus. In this case, that doesn't matter because you're using the camera's autofocus sensor and it is very, very fast. It is ridiculously fast and it's very good for holding things up, focusing on those things, and then jumping back to this, the subject's face for autofocus. So you have a few options with channel here. If you're using multiple YoloCams together, because they use, I don't even understand the technology behind this, but because they're using this system, they could potentially interfere with each other. If that's happening, you can then assign different channels to focus, and that way you can have multiple cameras right next to each other and they're not going to start interfering with each other. You have the ability to choose kind of traditional continuous autofocus or face detect autofocus, which is what I'm using right now because I want it to detect my face. And you also have standard or fast. I really like fast because I have found that it is very, very fast. Look how it's focus on me, focus on the camera, focus on me, focus on the camera. If you go to standard, it's still quite fast, but it's a little smoother. I think standard looks more like the Sony cameras I typically use, which is fantastic. Sometimes I have found fast can almost be a little jittery because it's like, it's trying to anticipate what's happening quickly. So it might even be better to use standard. And it's still quick. I can hold this up and have the camera focus on it and then focus right back on me, no problem. And that is pretty cool. Do I have to? I don't even have to totally cover my face and it'll focus on that. That's nice. Now, one thing you might notice is missing here right now is a manual focus option. That is something, if you've used any YOLO products, you know that they update stuff, software and firmware constantly. Pretty much every time I make a video on a YOLO product, by the time I'm done editing it, there has been an update from the time I filmed it. Like, it's very hard to keep them totally up to date. They did just add manual focus to the S3. So then there's a manual focus option, a slider, and you can focus it that way. And the same thing should be coming for the S7 very quickly. It's just not on the version that I'm using right now on this computer. So that's something that would be great in those situations where you don't want to deal with autofocus and you just want to make sure that it locks on, never moves, no matter what. You'll have a manual focus option hopefully soon. There is a zoom option. This is a digital zoom, which actually still does a pretty good job. If I zoom in, it doesn't really degrade the quality much, but we are cropping in digitally. We're not optically zooming in. Of course, it's an interchangeable lens camera, so I could just add a lens with some zoom on there if I wanted to. We have AI parameters right here, which I'm actually not going to adjust while I'm recording because it's going to change a lot of my settings. What that does, it looks at your whole image, it looks at all the settings, and then dials everything in to be, as high quality as possible based on what you're doing right there. I'm a control freak though, so I like going into exposure and white balance and adjusting these manually. Exposure, if I do auto exposure, now the camera will actually brighten things up more than I had it. I guess I was getting a little moody here with my manual exposure, trying to match my Sony camera. I can even bump this up to 250. So here you can see I have my aperture at f1.7, my ISO at 250, and my shutter speed at 160. If I'm in auto, then I can just choose middle, low, high, custom blurring. So if you don't know how f-stop works, aperture works, but you have this camera, you're like, I just want blurry background, you can just set blurring to high, go to auto, set blurring to high, and you don't have to worry about anything else. But if you want to dial in your settings like you would on a traditional camera, you can do that as well. Same with white balance. Right now, I tend to, this is just a stylistic choice, I tend to white balance and color grade everything to be a little cooler. Because again, I need all the help being cool I can get. This is auto white balance, significantly warmer than I had it here. And then you can also add in blue and red offsets if you want. So if you're trying to, either dial things in for your specific preferences. I'm gonna go back to my manual white balance. I have 4200 here. My blue offset is 1, my red offset is 2. I can change these or just click anywhere on this little spectrum here. And that helps if you're trying to match things in. You're trying to match this with a Canon or a Sony or a Nikon camera or whatever. Being able to adjust the blue and the red offset in your white balance helps match things up. And if I had this connected to my wonderful PC back here, I would actually have more color correcting options because on the YoloLiv Compose software for PC, there are some pretty advanced color correcting features that aren't currently on the Mac version. Coming to the Mac version, just not there yet, so I don't have them here, but I would have them if I had this connected to the PC. And then because we do have a 3.5mm input, we do have some audio settings. We can choose if it's mic or line in. We can change our gain. We can add noise reduction if we want to. We can even add in latency. So if we wanted to add in a delay to keep things in sync, if we needed to, we could do that. And we have automatic gain control. So I'm running my microphone just directly, my Rode wireless micro directly through USB into my computer. But if I'm running it through the camera, this is where I can adjust some of my audio settings. And then the one issue I've had with the S7 in my workflow, which is not something that everyone's going to deal with, but if you're like me, it might be something you encounter, is, where did it go? Here it is, the Elgato prompter. This is something I love, I use all the time. On my desk over here, I have my Canon EOS R set up permanently, and I have the prompter on it, and this is my, I use it for a lot of streams, podcasts, video calls, all the time. I would love to replace that with an S7 because it's a 4K camera. That Canon is a 1080 camera, but here's the one problem if you're trying to use this with the Elgato prompter. I don't have the Prompter XL, the bigger one, so I don't know if the sizes are a little bit different. But on the regular Elgato prompter, normally I put a lens adapter on my camera lens and I just hang the prompter off the lens, which I can totally do with this camera, except typically your camera focuses through the lens, what it's seeing through the lens. The S7 focuses through here. So if I put this here, maybe you can kind of see what the problem is. The autofocus sensor is now just looking at the side or the back of the prompter, which means you can't use autofocus when the camera is in the Elgato prompter. And that is a big bummer. I think it might be a solvable thing. I think, maybe. I haven't totally figured it out, but if I take off the back plate and then I put the YoloCam just through here, I put the lens through there, you can see it's just wide enough that you can see the camera's autofocus sensor right here. So if I could somehow position the camera like this, I actually think it could work. The prompter does have a shroud back plate, which is more open, and then it has a piece of fabric that hangs over the camera to block light, but it's not as open as this. This is no back plate, and that is pretty much where it needs to go. So I feel like maybe there's a mount I could play with or something I could 3D print, or there has to be a solution here, but I haven't figured it out just yet. I need to play with it a little bit more and then make sure that even though this is off to the edge, it can still work well enough to autofocus. I would love to be able to use this camera with the Elgato prompter because this is kind of a crucial part of my desk-based workflow. And currently I haven't been able to do that, which is why this is not my, main desk camera, even though I would like it to be. And that actually brings me to the main reason I wanted to make this video, which is who is this camera for? What workflows does it fit in? The main thing, the main criticism I've heard every time I've used this camera or made a video about it or talked about it is it has an MSRP of $700. By the time you add a lens, even a lens like this 25mm Lumix lens, this is one of the least expensive lenses you can get, it's still like 250 bucks. So now you're getting very close to $1,000 to get this camera up and running, and you can't take it out in the world like a camera. You don't have physical controls. I don't even have a screen. I could spend pretty much the same amount of money and get something like a Sony ZV-E10, maybe a little bit more money to get a nice prime lens with it. Why would I get this instead of an actual mirrorless camera? If you're somebody like me who loves cameras, I've loved cameras since I was 4 years old. I've saved up money to buy DSLRs and upgraded them and moved to full frame and moved to mirrorless, and I've spent time learning how to use cameras. I was a teacher for over a decade where I taught people how to use cameras. I love cameras. I like using cameras. I like the control of cameras. It's a big reason why the FX3 is my main camera, because I have all these controls and all this wonderful stuff on it. If you want to understand the S7, that means we have to do something that's sometimes rare on the internet and acknowledge that other people have different needs and preferences than we do. And what I mean by that is I love cameras, but not everybody does. But in today's world, people want good camera quality. They want this mirrorless look. They want blurry backgrounds. They want fast autofocus. They kind of want things that maybe look a little bit different, a little bit better than a phone, or a little bit better than just a standard webcam might look. But they don't necessarily want to spend the money on a full-on mirrorless camera setup, or more importantly, a lot of times, they don't want to deal with figuring out how mirrorless cameras work. They don't want to use one of these. My wife is a perfect example of this. She has a Sony ZV-E10 as her main camera in her office, and that camera has never left the tripod in almost 2 years that it's been there. It has never had a battery in it. It's always run off a dummy battery. It's never had a memory card in it because she records into a computer. But it is a great camera with awesome autofocus, awesome image quality. This camera wasn't released when we redid her office and got the Sony. If this had been out, this actually might have been a significantly better choice for her because she never wants to have to reach around and deal with the camera and adjust anything. If this is just here and it never moves and then you adjust everything through the computer and you still get the really nice autofocus, you still get really good, mirrorless camera image quality, low light performance, this is a perfect camera for that. And if you look at this camera, the fact that there's only a 1/4 20 on the bottom like this by default, tells you that it's also intended to be used vertically. So now we're talking about probably more casual situations where this is being used vertically, probably being used for extended periods of time. This camera is just made out of metal. As soon as you take it out of the box, you're gonna realize, oh, this feels really nice. The FX3 is ultra high quality. It's made out of mostly plastic with like metal chassis under it. This just feels like a slab of metal, and that's because this entire camera is a heat sink. So it will never overheat. I've had mine running days on end, hours on end. I've never ever had an S7 overheat. It should not ever overheat because that it's designed to just work. Plug and play, forget about it, never think about it. If you want to add in horizontal capabilities like I'm using right now, the camera does come with an L bracket, and this just has a little thumb screw on the side, and then this goes into the vertical mount, and now I have actually 3 quarter 20 mounts on the bottom, and this kind of just feels like a metal mount from a, a camera cage or a camera bracket. And now I can use this horizontally like a regular camera. So you have both options, but out of the box, it's designed as a vertical camera first. So that's what I meant when I said this is a camera for anybody, but not necessarily for everyone. It can be used in beginner workflows. You just want a nice camera, get this and you're good to go, but it can also be used in professional settings because it is a high quality camera, but it's not necessarily something that's going to work for everybody. If you want the traditional camera workflow with all the buttons and controls and you want to take this and be portable and not need it to be connected to anything, this is not the camera for you. But even if you're in a more professional setting, you're doing a multi-camera setup and you're just one person, you don't have camera operators behind each camera, now you can just have everything running into your computer. You can adjust all your settings this way. You can switch between your cameras, from whatever, a switcher or a computer, and you don't have to worry about going and changing anything on the camera itself. There are other cameras like, one of my favorite cameras being the Obsbot Tail 2, which is a PTZ camera. So now it's remote and it has PTZ functionality. But the difference between that and this is, well, the PTZ functionality, but also the mirrorless camera functionality. So the Tail 2 has a fantastic lens, has a good sensor, has wonderful image quality, but a Micro Four Thirds camera has better image quality. So what that means with the S7 and why I'm really excited about it is it opens up a lot of possibilities to people that normally might not have felt comfortable diving into that world. It's not just that you could get a mirrorless camera for roughly the same price, ever so slightly more money, you could get a ZV-E10. For people who are interested in cameras, that sounds like a huge benefit. Like, oh, I'd love to just get a full-on regular camera. For people who are not interested in cameras, that's actually not a selling point. They don't want that at all. But when you say, hey, have you ever used a webcam, just a USB webcam before? Here is a mirrorless camera that is just as easy to use as a USB webcam because that is what it is. Then it's a lot less intimidating. It's a lot more, it's a lot more fun and opens up a lot more possibilities to a lot more people. And I think that is super cool. And I've used the S7s in all kinds of different setups since I've had them. They're fantastic cameras. If you do want to see how I put together a full-on multi-cam podcast setup using the S7s and the S3, I have a separate video all about that right here.